Hello and welcome everyone to Influential Minds, an EEI International Conversation series. My name is Alekia Malavarpu and I'm a senior analyst for international programs at EEI. Influential Minds is our virtual conversation series, which aims to discuss ideas that move the needle towards a more sustainable future with thought leaders from across the globe. Today, EEI International Programs is excited to welcome Tom Flaherty, author and senior advisor at EY Parthenon. He joins us today live from EEI headquarters in Washington, D.C. to discuss his latest book, Roll Up, The Past, Present, and Future of Utilities, where he discusses how success is obtained in consolidation transactions and what can be expected in the future for electric power company mergers and acquisitions. He will be joined in conversation by our host, EEI Vice President of International Programs, Dr. Lawrence Jones. Throughout the session, please feel free to ask questions using the chat feature. Dr. Jones will aim to incorporate as many of them as possible into the conversation. Without further ado, I will turn this over to Lawrence to get us started.
Thank you. Tom, welcome to EEI.
Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Well, let me first of all start by congratulating you on the book.
Appreciate that.
Certainly a success. And we're going to have a conversation about the book. But I think before we do that, just tell us a little bit about why you wrote the book.
Well, there's a number of M&A books out in the public domain, but none of them tend to really respond to what is happening in utilities. So there was a large gap, not so much in the knowledge base, but just in the information that people could use to understand what was going on within the utility sector and how that evolved over time. So it's really just filling a gap and trying to provide some focused information to help people understand better about the sector.
It's interesting. So in filling the gap, I think one of the things you did in the process was getting insights from a number of CEOs and other experts in the industry. So talk about that whole process. How was it like?
It was easy to do. Most of the people that I had interviewed, were current former clients, and they were pretty eager to tell their story. Some of them were pioneers, being the first to be involved in the early stages of transactions. Some had done multiple transactions, and of course, they're professional service advisors that were supporting some of those clients specifically, and many others, throughout this early stage of consolidation. But they were happy to talk. They were very candid. And I think that you can see from the comments, they're very supportive of the notion of consolidation.
Yeah, it was intriguing reading the book and just observing their different perspectives. And we'll get into some of that and just get your views on that. So for anyone reading this book, Tom, what are the three key takeaways you would like the reader to sort of leave with?
I think that consolidation is a natural phenomenon across all industries, but in a sector like the utility sector, which is very diffused, very fragmented, 150 companies when we first started the modern era of M&A at the end of 1994, down to less than 50 tradable companies today. So it was a natural evolution to occur. I think the second thing is that there's a lot of discussion about the validity of benefits from a transaction. And our perspective is that savings are real. The impacts to the companies themselves are beneficial. The companies, when they undertake a transaction, also look at making sure that the relevant stakeholders like customers, communities, et cetera, are not adversely affected. So that's a major takeaway. The value is real. That's a justification for why people are undertaking consolidation to begin with. I think the third thing is the transactions aren't easy to do. They're very hard. In the early days of consolidation, going back to 1995 to 2000, 3 out of 5 proposed deals never got to the announcement stage. Not that they failed later, they never got to the announcement stage to begin with. And the reasons for that were several. It is good to be king, when you're the CEO of a large company, and these are getting to be very, very large companies today. So it's difficult to envision giving that up, particularly if there's going to be some other losses to friends of yours and executives and the like. So social issues were a big constraint. Another one is when CEOs talk to one another. Sometimes they can be ships passing in the night. was thought to be heard and thought to be said can be different. So sometimes pricing, turned out to be a major impediment because while people would like to get low premium to no premium deals as an acquirer, an acquiree obviously wants the inverse of that. They want as much premium as they can. So getting them to bridge that gap together turned out to be difficult. And then regulation has various forms, whether at the federal level or at the state level, turned out to be an impediment. Early in the stages of consolidation was because FERC in the states arm wrestled a little bit over who had jurisdiction over exactly what. And in other cases, regulators just didn't think that the benefits were real and that the impacts to the customer could be adverse. So why take the risk?
Yeah. So, given your storied career in the industry, 4 to 5 years, and you've done a lot. When you gather those insights from those different CEOs, what surprised you the most in terms of the insights you were hearing? Was there anything that stood out in terms of the feedback?
So it really wasn't a surprise. I think it was more of an affirmation. This was good to get. Oftentimes, the industry seems to shy away from talking about consolidation, and for obvious reasons. They don't want to indicate to the market they might be thinking about doing something. They don't want to tip their hand in case they have something in mind. But when it comes down to it, I think the utility CEOs are very supportive of consolidation because it's what's necessary when you have that fragmented sector to be able to bring efficiency to delivery, to create the growth platform, and to be able to create the financial profile that will allow you to build and deliver on the strategy that might not otherwise have been available in the absence of that on a standalone basis. So all of those factors, I think, came out from the interviews in their comments, from the CEO interviews in their comments. And it was an affirmation, I think, of what the industry had been doing, as well as an affirmation of the benefits from consolidation and how CEOs, when looking back, could see those benefits being materialized.
Yes, you talk about the affirmation. I think it's certainly something to keep an eye on. But I want to go back just in terms of history for those who are listening who are not sort of a deeply versed in this industry. Talk about the phases of this process, because we started off with several hundred utilities, right? So talk about the different phases and how we got to where we are today.
Well, if you go back far enough, at around 1900, there were more than 3,000 utilities. Now, some of these were actually serving city blocks, city neighborhoods, portions of a city. It wasn't until around 1900 when Consolidated Edison got created that it became more of a centralized provider of electricity. But these companies, the scale of them could be electric, could be gas, could be trolleys, it could be ice. It could be any other kind of transit. So going from 3,000 to 6,500 in a period of about 10 years, and then down to slightly more than 2,000 over the next 20 years, before things actually caught up with them in terms of changing the basic structure of the industry when the SEC took over responsibility for the Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935. That was legislated then. And that changed the whole structure of the sector. And a lot of consolidation occurred over that time frame as people tried to bring sense to what had been there before. Lots of holding companies. There was stacking of holding companies, a lot of non-arm's length transactions, things of that nature. And that's what the SEC was trying to do. When you got to that point, then that 2,000 companies ultimately got reduced to about 200 holding companies, 200 holding companies that continued to slide to about 18 a little bit later in that cycle. And what the SEC did was during that period from 1935 until the late 50s, which actually oversee the consolidation of the sector and the smoothing out of the holding companies. But what I write about in the book is the modern era. So about 1994 to 2020, 2021. And of course, there were some small transactions occurring over the time that were unrelated to what the SEC was doing. But they're generally very, very small companies. And there's 5 cycles we talked about in the book that kind of gave rise to what was the momentum associated with pursuing a transaction in various stages over time. Because they were very different depending on the 5-year period that you look at.
Yeah.
But the 3 factors which might be attributed to increasing consolidation was the potential for competition, the desire to grow scale, and then the desire to grow the breadth of the business in a way in which it could provide more efficiency to both the current business and to an acquired combined business as well.
So those were the 3 drivers, more or less, right?
They changed a little bit over time.
Yeah.
For example, during the 5 cycles, right after we went through this competitiveness and conversions, where people in the power sector looked at acquiring natural gas LDCs because they thought it'd be important to own both sources of fuel for common customers, because you could have 2 or more electric gas companies overseeing, or excuse me, serving and overseeing the delivery model for a large metropolitan area. Dallas had 5 electric and gas utilities, for example.
What I like about the book also is the emphasis in describing the role of the Security Exchange Commission, SEC, and what it did. So let's talk about successful consolidation. So in the book, you walk through this process of what makes things successful, what makes transactions successful. Talk about that, but then emphasize also the importance of scale and synergy, because those are 2 things you spend a lot of time in the book talking about: scale and synergy.
Let's separate the 2.
Sure.
To be successful in a transaction, it really starts with doing rigorous planning before you ever get to the point of announcing a transaction. So when you're talking to a potential partner, it really makes sense to have done your homework and do a lot of thinking about what it's going to take to be successful on the outside of this merger. There's a lot of factors that can derail. Regulation is one of them. Government is another one. Other kinds of policies emerge from other sectors within government, whether it's state versus federal. So it's important to have a real good eye on what the outcomes are expected to be and what you'd like to accomplish. So that means rather than just talking about the strategic benefits associated with the transaction, you need to talk about the practical benefits, some of which are regulatory. How do we get something approved? What does that look like in terms of what the elements are that are being considered? Second is, where does the value come from, and how is the value distributed over time? So that affects the shareholders, whether they're the stakeholders, whether they're shareholders or whether they're customers in the local communities. So it makes sense to, even in a press release when it's defined, not just talk about strategic logic, but talk about where the company goes from here. Lay out the regulatory strategy, specify the regulatory plan, talk about what the savings distribution will be, define what the integration time period is going to be and how you're going to do that to ensure that those results are actually achieved. So I think there's a lot of lessons learned from what companies have undergone in prior transactions to see what worked and what didn't work, what was received well and what was not. So it all goes back to making sure that the outset, that you set the tone for the transaction and you made the case for the transaction as well as you can before you're filing your application, coincident with the announcement. But beyond that is when the real work starts. So you've got to go through a transaction with a time frame that might be, it used to be 12 to 16 to 20 months to get a transaction approved, but now it's been reduced to about 8 to 9 months, depending on the jurisdiction. So you've got to be able to file an application quickly. You've got to be able to make sure that the case is well laid out and persuasive within that, that there's sufficient description, delineation, and rationale given for not just the why, but also the what and how. And the benefits, again, these are total benefits, not just synergies that are going to be made available to customers and communities. And then you've got to get through the process. And it's a very different process. It's not a rate case process. It's not as granular sometimes as the rate case rises above in terms of the issues being considered. But you still get a lot of discovery. You get a lot of pushback. It's a very lawyer-rich environment, because you have lawyers representing everybody.
Yeah.
And there's multiple interveners, and most of the interveners have different points of view. They don't always agree on what an end result might be. The company has to incur a lot of cost to just navigate that process. But once you get to the approval stage, you haven't done anything then in terms of being able to realize benefits. All you've done is earn the opportunity to capture those benefits. So then you've got to execute very, very well to make sure that what you said was going to happen can in fact come to fruition within the time frame that you anticipated and in the manner that you originally thought that it might be. So it's really a process that starts very early in the process, but continues all the way through. And there's lots of risks that shareholders, for example, take on throughout those stages of the process. It's something I think we're going to talk about later.
Yes, absolutely. So, I know you talk about the U.S. investor utilities, and you talk about how M&A will take place in the U.S., but just venture outside. This is EEI International Program, so we're always keen on international stuff. Talk about the U.S. utilities who ventured outside and what that international M&A will look like during this phase that you've talked about, the period you've discussed?
There's a chart book which I think catalogs the international acquisitions. I'll just guess by memory, but I think there's maybe 8 to 10 different countries that people participated in. Some in Latin America, a lot in Western Europe, and also down in Australasia. Some companies, some U.S. companies, weren't as many as 4 of those jurisdictions elsewhere. It was a great learning experience. You got to remember these transactions were being pursued in the late 90s to early 2000s. That was when competition within the U.S. was beginning to get serious consideration. It was functional unbundling of assets in business segments. People thought that retail customers would be open to full-on access and competition. Other countries were ahead of the U.S. in that competitive restructuring. The UK, for example, Australia. And so those models around open markets looked intriguing in terms of what they might be able to provide. So companies thought, as I mentioned, they would need to be ready for those things to occur. So what could they learn from those people who had preceded them? Well, that was Western Europe, mostly the UK, because the privatization effort was going on in that time frame. There were about 12 recs that got offered to the public, and the US was an acquirer of more than half a dozen of those. So that was a great learning laboratory for them, because they could see what a couple of year head start on competition would look like and what the requirements would be in terms of what they would need to do with their infrastructure in the way in which they thought going to market with customers and building the right kind of relationship with customers. But then what happened after that? Well, it was the early 2000s recession. It was Enron and WorldCom, things that upset the financial markets, which caused investors to look a little bit askance at those kinds of investments, even though they were related to the sector that were in Europe. So that caused U.S. companies to retrench. Some wanted to monetize their investment because they thought they got out of it what they could, and this was a good time to market it because other European companies were buying. But there was just a bit of a retrenchment. Now, 1 or 2 companies kept those investments for a much longer period because they thought that they were paying off well, and they wanted to learn more. In fact, they expanded more in terms of some of the countries they participated in. But it was really a desire to kind of buttress up your own understanding of what it would take to successfully compete, and the kinds of requirements that would follow along with that, and what coming out the end of that you might want to envision a company could look like in a competitive environment.
So you had a lot of U.S. companies, a number of them anyway, that went outside to try and sort of learn, if you may, about the M&A activities.
Also, it wasn't learning about M&A per se. It was learning about how a business that they had operated for 100 years could be pretty significantly affected. So, for example, if customers were going to be unbundled and open for retail access anywhere, that was an environment the utilities had never had to deal with. Okay. Customers were always there; they were the incumbent provider. But if you had to compete for those customers, particularly in something that was just a commodity, where customers didn't understand the reasons why couldn't I use the old company I had? Why do I need to go to a new one? And customers are generally inert. They don't like those kinds of changes and interruptions. They knew they were going to have to retool. Same thing with getting rid of the generation business. That was the supply source. Those assets some of those were 50, 60-year-old assets that were occurring, potentially traded at that point in time. So what kind of requirement did that invoke on individual utilities, because they had to find a supply source with their own transmission, still deliver it through the network. In many cases, they still held customers where they were the default provider to customers. That shrunk the company. It changed their market capitalization, changed their financial capital commitments. It changed how they would think about financing going to market. So it caused them to just rethink what's the purpose now of being an integrated company yesterday, and now being a pipes and wires company today.
So let me just say to the audience, if you have any questions, please put it in the chat. We'll get to as many questions as possible. So we've talked about U.S. utilities trying to sort of acquire international utilities. Talk about the reverse. International utilities coming to the U.S. Where does that stand today?
There's only a couple of international buyers today, not buyers, holders today. There have been a number of international buyers in the past. Scottish Power has been here, for example. Iberdrola is here, National Grid is here. Earlier, Aon was here. Larger Western European companies, which were far bigger at that point in time than the U.S. companies. They seem to, and there's a host of other European companies like EDF, for example. TEPCO is here from Japan, that all own assets within the business. And there's non-utilities like BP, Shell, Total, for example, that do the same thing. So the international folks have looked at the U.S. because there was a stable environment, known regulation. So if some companies were very interested in just following the privatization model and going to Latin America, for example, well, that's a place where not every country has transparency. Whereas the U.S. has a very transparent marketplace, has the rule of law established, and it's easy for them to think about how to operate successfully within the business, within the country. So that was an attractive market for them. But they ran into some issues that they didn't necessarily understand the regulatory environment like they thought they did. Things meant something different. When you talked about it in the UK or Australia versus what it means in the US. And eventually it came to the point where many of them thought it was more important to monetize their investments. But again, a couple have stayed, and Iberdrola has increased through Avangrid, its position in the U.S. National Grid has increased its position in the U.S. But it's hard to anticipate that there are going to be more international buyers. They certainly would have an interest. But U.S. companies now, the marketplace has grown, it's become very bifurcated between large and small. And it's tougher for the European market caps, which have come down relative to a lot of the U.S. players, to find the right kind of buys. For them.
It's interesting because of late there was an announcement, I think 2 weeks ago, or maybe last week, regarding I think it was Con Ed that is selling off some of their assets to RWP. Do you see those kinds of transactions occurring more where you don't actually have a full acquisition of the utility, but the utility might get rid of some of its assets and those get procured by a foreign buyer? You see that?
Well, it's been going on for the last 10 to 15 years.
Okay.
Once assets run the market or portfolios run the market, they became very attractive. Now with other things, when companies have come downstream into the marketplace, it looks like an attractive market. The portfolio of assets seems to be attractive to them. They can buy them at a price that is reasonable to them. Con Ed at $6.8 billion gross price. That's a good day at the office if you can get something like that. But for another buyer, another owner who can make higher and better use of those assets, it looks like it's a great strategic move. I think the other thing to be aware of is a lot of the sales of non-core utility, but adjacent utility assets is also occurring a little bit because there's a desire on Wall Street to rationalize what the profile of the company is in terms of its investment and to kind of get back to a core business. It's easier to understand. Maybe the non-regulated businesses aren't that significant anyway, so it's not as important to them. But more importantly, they're very important to something else. And people are getting very, very good prices, whether it's domestic or international buyers, for assets, portfolios of assets, lines of business, or properties.
We'll come back and talk a little bit about the conditionality, or the conditions that have made the U.S. sort of an attractive market for utilities being bought up. But I want to go to the comment we see here from John Jeffrey regarding the issue on used cost markup for Power Plus T&D, where the wires are paid for. And his position here is that, are we headed towards a world of Genco splitting from T&D to drive innovation? What, any comments on history?
I'll have to break that maybe up into a couple of pieces.
Sure.
It's hard for me to envision now that those companies that are integrated don't want to be integrated in the future. And it's hard to envision that regulators, either at the federal or the state level, will try to push companies into that particular posture. One of those factors that affects that is, of course, security of supply. So people have seen what things look like, Western Europe right now. People have begun to see the U.S. when you shut off drilling. What happens with security of supply here and price of that supply. So I think that there's a great deal to be said for maintaining stability in the delivery model. And companies have always bought generation from other sources, through unit sales contracts, just general power exchanges by neighbors. So there's always the opportunity to supplement what's there. And companies have to do that a lot because renewables are intermittent. So you have to find additional sources, whether it's your own backup or somebody else's. But I don't think that there's a momentum toward it like there was in 1995. Okay. And people have seen sort of what happened in those unstructured markets or restructured markets. The second point to maybe comment on was just the notion of innovation. So innovation right now is happening throughout the industry. The industry is doing a pretty good job of being able to move from where they were. And I think one could probably fix a point of when they began to think about innovation in 2013 or 2014. That has evolved since then. But the industry has been around a long time. If you go to many companies, they have many walls that are filled with patents that they've developed over time, very technical ones. Now the innovation is less about those technical accomplishments, and it's more about changing the way in which the business operates, change the way in which it positions itself with the customer, what's its new purpose and its new role with the customer, and thinking about how to take disruptive technology and apply it, in a way that's very attractive and useful, to a customer, where the shareholder gets benefit from the adoption and deployment, and the customer gets benefit from the same things. So I don't think, just to tie up the question, that there's a lot of factors that are driving momentum in changing the current model. But all it takes is something to come out of Washington, and things can change overnight. But again, the states have great control over what they do, independent of what happens here.
So talking about the state in Washington, and let's talk about some of the risks regarding getting the transactions to work or not to work, and specifically talk about the evolution of the regulatory system in support of M&A or as a hurdle towards.
It'll take some time to unpack that question. There's a lot of risk associated with the transaction I mentioned earlier. But if you think about the shareholder risk and the customer risk, they're very, very different and they're very, very unbalanced. Shareholders take risk from the moment they begin to think about it. The management begins to think about a transaction, because the shareholders are going to have to ultimately approve the transaction, the funding of that. So they're very dependent on the board. They're very dependent on management to make smart decisions about who is an attractive combination partner, and the states that partner may be operating in are fair in terms of the treatment of utilities, and that they will achieve an agreement on a fair price, not an excessive price, not a price that's below the value. So from the beginning, they're taking the risk that the transaction will move forward and nothing adverse will occur to the utility from undertaking the transaction, like getting off track on their strategy, which is one of the typical concerns people have. Once you get to an announcement, those risks expand again, because now you've announced what a price is, you've announced what the mechanism is, stock for stock, maybe stock and cash, maybe it's all cash. You've set some conditions or guardrails around the transaction needs to accomplish, what the commission is going to have to base its decision on. And then you've got to execute through a very adverse process. Adverse in the sense that sometimes staffs line up against transaction. Sometimes commissions actually make comments to that end. Interveners may line up against a transaction. Some of it is negotiating because they want something else out of the transaction. The company may not be offering. Sometimes it's a carry forward from a rate case. That issue never got resolved. And sometimes it's just, they don't want to take the risk, and they don't like the impacts, for example, of something like job loss or headquarters loss or something of that nature. So all of those risks get amplified during the course of this approval process. And then when you get to a regulatory order, again, there's a revisitation around the transaction. Like, is this a fair and equitable outcome? Something we'll talk about a little bit later. And then once the transaction gets approved and closed, then the shareholders and board are all thinking about the risks associated with execution. So there's that word again, execution. You have to be really good at what you set out to do. What are the expectations for what might happen with synergies, timing of those synergies, changes in business? Either might not occur or they might get delayed. So there's risk throughout it, and the book enumerates a number of what those risks are. But that's one of the factors that sort of sets up the tone, for a transaction at the beginning, defines the parameters around which the decision basis will be determined by a commission, and then provides the roadmap for how results will actually occur. And remember, they're doing this transaction for a couple of reasons. One is to gain scale. The utility industry as a whole has not been as successful at capturing the value of scale as you might think, and as an industrial company might. And when you get to scale, sometimes it comes down to how do I really create the operating model to leverage this portfolio that I now have. So you get value of scale by thinking about how to optimize the operations across the business as a whole. But they also do it to find a broader growth platform, where maybe now I have a stronger balance sheet, so I can build and invest in things I couldn't before. Maybe it's now that I can build a successful platform from one transaction to provide the basis for how I move to the second transaction. That's another piece of it, because now I've developed expertise, and that expertise will travel from one transaction to the next. Sometimes it's to secure the customer base and provide a larger customer base more opportunity to engage, with the utility around future product services and offerings. So all those things go into the notion of why the transaction, how do I execute, where are the risks, what I want to get out of it. And I think it's scale is one of the big factors that companies go into a transaction trying to accomplish. But sometimes they have a tougher time actually getting to that end, because all decisions are about people.
Yeah.
The first word in merger is me. And that sometimes just manifests itself in many different ways.
Yeah, the thing is interesting. So understanding the importance of scale, understanding how you capture the value of scale, and also the value of synergies are very important that you've touched upon. I just want to talk briefly about the issue around, you said, we have multiple tiers in the utility sector in terms of market cap. We have the big ones, the biggest being NextEra with about 150 billion market cap, and the small one being Unitil, I guess, with about $1 billion. One digit. So what are the necessary conditions you think if someone listens to this conversation, say based in Germany or based in Japan, and saying, look, we would like to have similar kinds of market cap numbers for our utilities in our countries. What are some of the conditions you think that would make it feasible to see those kinds of market cap numbers for our utilities around the world?
Well, it's an interesting question, because what's driven market caps in the past for the U.S. companies and for the international companies is not what drives market caps today.
Okay.
Let me step back again to what drove the scale growth in the industry in the late 19th century, leading into the 20th century. Because you had the proliferation of all these individual isolated networks. Could be a block, could be neighborhood, could be a facility or a factory, could be something beyond that. Well, it was electrification. So electrification was the big driver then. And where are we today? Electrification is going to be the big driver now. Yeah. There's going to be a tremendous amount spent in capital to grow the system in the old traditional ways, and now change and grow the system in unconventional ways. So that's going to drive capital requirements from a mode of where they've been for resilience and modernization, into something which is now is going to be very different in terms of what the base of devices, sensors, monitors, all those things are, and what the fundamentals are for supporting something like mobility. So it's going to be a very, very different market. And just like if you looked at the book, there's a tremendous explosion of sales, megawatt or kilowatt hour consumption. Well, it's going to happen again. So when you have that kind of growth, that forces you to build the infrastructure to be able to support that. And so even in the U.S., which is well developed, you're going to see an explosion of capital that hasn't been seen before. Now, if you transfer that or translate that into a developing country, it's the same thing. Maybe the stage they're at in terms of electrification is nowhere close to what a developed country's level of electrification might be. And they may leapfrog things. That's why you see the expansion of microgrids, or the installation of microgrids is a way of delivering power to specific customers for specific needs. But if you're in a country that doesn't have large central load pockets, doesn't have the ability to attract capital to it, doesn't have steady cash flow because of the isolated islands of different investment to be able to support that. Electrification might be the great equalizer because it will figure out and find a way to tie things together and take a group of microgrids, essentially aggregate them, build the network, but build it in a different way.
Yeah.
And that's going to be, I think, not just explosion in the U.S., but you can think about the scale of other continents like Africa, where it's a growth we can't conceive of just because of the nature of what the starting point is.
Yeah.
So electrification then, electrification now is going to be the great push.
Interesting. So electrification being the big push. I want to come back on microgrids because what fascinates me and something I've been thinking about, I'd love to get your thoughts on. Do you think there's an optimal point at which a microgrid owner sees an opportunity to become a macrogrid? Because the US started, you could say, with a bunch of microgrids all over the place, right? And now you see the push for microgrids around the world. But should we be careful in thinking that at some point, those microgrid owners will want to consolidate and expand, and then we need to have a big microgrid similar to what we have in the US?
Sure, I think you see that in a lot of countries where it was important to get electrification started and put some kinds of assets. One of the first sources of supply, if you want to call it a microgrid, were military jet engines from Russia in island environments. And that goes back into when the Soviet Union fell apart. And what they thought about ways to monetize the investment they had in these old used engines. So they put them on islands, some of their own, some throughout the Indian Ocean as well as Australasia. So that's sort of happened. That people have to think about, how do I move from something that is sort of an islanded investment to something that's more cluster. The cluster is then sort of the definition of how you tie some of those things together. So there's entrepreneurs that are out there looking for ways to do that now, particularly in Africa, and thinking about leveraging investments they individually have made, maybe working with partnerships, thinking about how to bring those into something that's a much larger scale than what they had in the past. But what is going to influence what they do is the ability to obtain capital. And so World Bank financing is what it is, but it goes through a different source. So it has to be secondary or tertiary channel to get down to an individual investor like that. And that's where some of the roadblocks exist, where the credit quality isn't there. The growth won't come fast enough. Even when they tie microgrids into something like a macro grid, however you want to define that, that doesn't give you sufficient scale.
No.
But it will come slow because it's the obvious solution. But there's got to be capital to support what people actually want to do.
And I think for that capital, Tom, there is a role for governments in those countries to play in terms of creating the right enabling environment. What do you say?
What's the role they have to play?
Okay.
Because there's no other source to do it. You can't have the right kind of financing framework, economic framework, and regulatory framework. It's very difficult to make those kinds of advances. And I think that's one of the issues that Eastern Europe got through, Latin America has gotten through. There's still plenty of issues there, and for more developing countries which are less populated and more widely dispersed, it becomes just more difficult to tie those together because now you're moving against historical patterns of how people choose to live. So the government has to be the forcing function for this to occur. And sometimes it may be not just the individual government, maybe it's an organization of countries that band together to do that.
You talked about the regulatory risk and other risks that seem to be sort of intrinsic in these kinds of transactions, and you have to navigate them the best you can. As we enter the new phase of M&A and we think of things changing, do you see any changes to this process in terms of regulatory hurdles being, less, or do you see other challenges coming that I think, we should be aware of?
Yeah. Let me go back to something I really didn't answer for you first. We were talking about synergies. I kind of skipped by that. First of all, as I mentioned, transactions are difficult. have to align the stars, and it's very difficult to accomplish that. When you put a case together, you have the acquirer or partners in a merger of equals. You have a picture of what they're trying to accomplish from a value point of view. If they want to avoid earnings dilution, they'd like to make the transaction accretive, they'd like to get a fair outcome in terms of the synergies. And remember what the synergies are, basically. At least traditionally, it's always been economies of scale, the overlap, and duplication, and the ability to redirect or repurpose capital, and the ability to think about how to grow revenue streams within the customer. Now, there's other things too around organizing the balance sheet a little bit different from a financing point of view. But now those synergy elements are expanding. Now you have a whole focus on net zero, which is causing will cause people to expend tremendous amounts of new capital to either wind down existing portfolios or in fact to stand up new types of assets, supply sources, as well as to deploy the technologies like storage, long-duration storage. Well, those things are now a different kind of phenomenon when someone thinks about a transaction approval process. We mentioned the risks up front, shareholders. Customers have risks too, but the risks there are just the results will emerge that the utility promised, but the track record is pretty good. Savings get realized. Companies close, within a reasonable time frame of their expectations. The companies continue to operate in a very effective manner. There's not issues that are created for the customer when those occur. But the problem with transactions in the recent past, as I would say 2012 through today, and the transactions going forward, is going to be the ability to obtain an equitable outcome. So when companies file a case, and often they file for a 50-50 sharing of what the outcomes will be, which is fair in the service. And sometimes if there's fuel savings for the customers, that shifts the preponderance of savings to the customer side, which is fine, because they're passed through anyway. But what companies are finding is that the savings are not sort of 50-50 today, the majority of cases. Part of it is because the application is getting filed it's sort of incomplete. It doesn't provide enough time to talk and persuade around the value of the transaction and its benefits and how those should be considered relative to the risk. So one thing that will change, I think, in the model is companies will need to talk more about total benefits than they have in the past. They'll need to incorporate them into the value equation and make that case to regulators, not just to think only about synergies and cost to achieve. So they're going to have to, and some companies have been doing that. So it's a number of jobs potentially created. For example, you do something through economic development. It's what they're doing with customers, for example, through low-income programs and distribution of capital. It's what they do through charitable contributions. That allows them, those NGO organizations to do. So they're going to have to get more instinctive about painting the picture of where value comes from and value is provided to all sources, so that you can then make the case. Let's put the case forth that if these are all the inputs in terms of the values, then there's a set of outcomes that would seem to be appropriate to be able to support that and recognize it. But right now, companies, if they pay a premium, it sits on the balance sheet, unless there's an impairment test. But you don't get a return on it, you don't get a recovery. If you have an inequitable savings distribution, it's not 50-50, let's say 75-25 to customers, that's sort of inequitable. If your cost to achieve that you actually spend out of pocket aren't recognized and recovered, that's value destructive. So right now, the accumulation of all these things, and we're talking about it in an article that's coming out fortnightly, the first part of September, November, the first part of December, that really points this out and puts the sort of the equation together around how is value destruction occurring, and what do you do about it. And most commissions over time have been very responsive and very fair with their applying utilities. But if the utilities don't prepare the application that leads the regulator to being able to have the preponderance of evidence to support what you're looking for, and you don't ask for things where you're not going to get them, which means you're going to have value destruction, which is where the industry sort of has been. So that's going to be an important factor in value framework going forward. And the total benefits is part of the value framework, but it's also part of thinking about ways to increase benefits to the communities and other stakeholders. Maybe the new item is going to be basically around electrification combined with decarbonization, because they run it in different directions.
Yeah.
I'm reducing a rate base and replacing it with something different, which operates very differently, which requires the backup of the portfolio is a little bit different. And the technology that you need, whether it's CCUS, or it's long duration storage, or it's hydrogen, is sliding past 2030. And before it's going to be maybe not even a parity, but going to be sort of ready from a functionality point of view. So that provides something new to talk about in terms of how a transaction can help companies accelerate their path toward net zero and provide greater certainty about the ability to accomplish net zero. Because net zero is really hard. Headwinds far exceed tailwinds to be able to accomplish that. And electrification, of course, is going to go the other way. It's going to provide benefits to everybody involved, but it's expensive. It's going to have to be financed, and rates potentially are going to go up because just the new capital piece. Yeah. All those things have to be balanced. And when you get into an M&A transaction, you don't want to bring all the other adjacent issues in, but there may be, because of the broader backdrop, an inability to avoid some of that. You don't want to make those the central issues, but they all have a role to be considered.
Yeah, we got about 10 minutes left, Tom, and I want to spend some time talking about the future. But before we get to the future, you talk about, in essence, you were talking about portfolio rationalization to some extent. Talk about ESG, because one of the things that have sort of gotten a lot of discussion of late is this role of ESG and the impact it's having on the industry. What role do you see that playing in the thinking around value creation for these kind of deals that we see happening in the next couple of years?
Well, that's a difficult question. So is it ESG as we've known it the last couple of years, or ESG as we're going to know it in the future? So there's a great a great difference in thought around what's the purpose of ESG. Mm-hmm. So, it's environmental, social, it's governance. What seems to get more attention today? Sometimes it's social. Governance. So sometimes it's been little e. We'll need to get back to big E for environmental, and to separate those, and to bring some coherency, I think, to what ESG is supposed to be about. You want to support and drive an outcome, but the way in which it's been done right now, there's been just absolute proclamations about what people will or won't do. Some of that hasn't been toured yet, but you can see when some of the states push back, oh, that's your objective around industries that are important to us, that we're just not going to deal with you going forward. So ESG, I think, is in a process. It's in a shift change right now. It's in the process of not maturing per se, but changing. And I think people are going to be rethinking that. So in a transaction, it's just part of the backdrop. Where does a transaction actually place you when it's complete? Have you advanced the goals that ESG theoretically has in its conventional sense, to accomplish more, maybe accomplish things faster, and create some certainty about direction, or does a transaction become relatively unaffected by it at all because it's not part of the transaction? It's something the companies deal with to the side. Now, I shouldn't say to the side in the sense it's not dominant, because it does dominate thinking, but it's not necessarily it's not necessarily part of the domain of a transaction, but it's going to get addressed just because it's just a dominant part of conversation now, even though it's not a dominant part of the facts of the case.
So I know the book focused mainly on the U.S., Tom, but as you were giving your last response, something just came up to me and I want to just ask your thoughts. So if I took this book and went to Europe or went to Japan or Australia, are there lessons in this book that you think might be applicable in other countries?
Sure. I think the back half of the book really talks more about execution, because the front end is the circumstances, and the circumstances will definitely be different. The starting point is very different now in some places, like Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Latin America. There's been a lot of consolidation. Canada. But the back half is around what we just have been talking about a little bit. How do you execute them? And those lessons learned, those practices that we've seen that have been successful, those ways of going about planning a transaction, setting the transaction up appropriately, communicating about the transaction, and executing it are kind of timeless, and they travel. Now, circumstances will be different because regulatory models are different from country to country, just like they are state to state in the US. So governmental backdrop models will be different. So they'll have to be tailored to fit those. But in order to be successful in a transaction, it's kind of the fundamental building blocks that are important. And that's being able to create a strategic logic, price it right, craft an attractive and compelling regulatory plan, demonstrate sufficient synergies to provide benefits, illustrate that you're going to be able to execute well and improve it at the end of the day. Those are the table stakes that you have to be successful.
Yeah.
And then what you can do on top of that by leveraging the platform you just built or defined, is how that plays out a little bit more.
Well, what I like in the book, in the section towards the end, is where you outline some of the questions to be asked.
Yeah.
So in the sense, you could say the book is split between why you do M&A and how you do M&A. Right. And I think and the how part. So let's now maybe spend the last few minutes we have talking about your optimism, because towards the end of the book, you come across very optimistic about the future of M&A in the utility sector. In fact, you lay out some reasons why you think that it's going to continue, or there are opportunities or potential for it to continue. Talk a little bit about your optimism. Why you feel so optimistic about the potential for more deals being done in the industry?
And I think this probably transcends borders. It's true in the U.S. It's true in Canada. It's true elsewhere. There are still probably too many utilities. What do you think about it? We started with 150. We're under 49 tradable companies now. The notion of
my goodness, not cutting you off, but Tom, Germany has several thousand utilities.
Well, the Stadtwerk,
yeah,
all the local municipalities,
exactly.
and Ontario had much the same too.
Exactly.
It's also very large.
Okay.
But the fact that people continue to pursue, where's the efficiency frontier? Can a combination help me achieve that? Because that's the way to drive costs down. So particularly in a cost increasing environment like where we are today, which will stay high for some period of time, inflationary point of view, and with the impacts that customers are looking for, they want to see value in what you provide, and they want to see it at a reasonable cost. You kind of have to go down that path, particularly when you're increasing capital. So right now, you hope that sales will provide a way to minimize cost impacts because the denominator grew. But you've got to work the numerator still at the same time, which is get costs down. There's plenty of utilities out there. 35% of the companies are in the largest range, which is like $20 billion or higher. About 30% are in the smallest, which is under 10 billion, mostly under $7 billion. So it's a barbell model right now. There's plenty of room to consolidate among the smaller companies. There's not much of a middle. So the middle has a view of what can I do with some of the smaller companies, or can I grow between us to get a little bit larger? And the interesting thing will be when you've got 20 companies greater than 20 billion, next year at 150 billion at the top end. When you put several of those together, all of a sudden you begin to increase the scale. So I think there's something like half a dozen, which are maybe seven, about 40 billion or more in terms of market cap. Well, then you start to increase the size of the industry, the size of the individual competitors, and you get more significant regional representation. And that's a way to use an operating model to be able to drive costs down and have a business. Well, what's going to be interesting, and regulators have been supportive of transactions, not as supportive in terms of all the more recent decisions that we'd like to see, but they have been over time. They're going to be looking at these transactions and trying to understand what did it really do. One concern that has been around since the early 2000s is that just like there's a statement about a bank too big to fail, regulators have their corollary to that, which is too big to regulate. Now no one's ever seen that yet. Companies haven't grown big enough. We're not a national champion like we exist in Germany or France or Italy. So it's never been sort of illustrated empirically. And when we've had to deal with the notion of diseconomies of scale, which is one of the outcomes of too big to regulate, the economies of scale continue to exist. Diseconomies of scale do not arise because of transactions. If any existed, it's because of the operating model on a standalone basis that the company had. the transaction may be solved. So I think the more transactions occur, the more we're going to run into issues that we haven't had to address before because of the shrinking environment, population, transactions. But the industry is well positioned to be able to prove through efficient operating model design that economies of scale will continue. Just economies of scale is not an issue. So too big to regulate is not an issue. There may be a theoretical limit for the size of the utility, but we haven't reached it yet.
No. Well, I think two last questions, Tom. One has to do with storytelling. So you've written a fantastic book. I enjoy reading it. I love the examples and the interviews you did with some of the CEOs. Do you think, as an industry, we've done a good job in telling the story about the benefits and the value of consolidation for customers and others to understand? Because the reason I bring it up, you're not hearing discussions about the need to, break away from this model, maybe create municipalities more and more and get away from what we have today. Do we need to do a better job in telling the story about the value of consolidation in our industry?
I think the industry has a task in front of it that this needs to communicate better, period. It needs to educate. It needs to increase the level and the depth of awareness. So whether it's technologies, electrification, decarbonization applications, transactions, the like, I think generally the industry just needs to sort of stand back and think about the audience and where the audience starts. Remember, every regulatory commissioners have an average tenure of about 2.5 years before they cycle on to something else. Staffs are permanent for the most part. So you're always talking to an audience that is shifting. So I think it would behoove the sector to actually step back when they think about a transaction and really focus the way in which they frame it. And they create the press release, they create the application, filing for approval. With all of that in mind, how do I educate? How do I demonstrate? How do I illustrate in depth? And how do I persuade that this transaction is not carrying excessive risk? It's actually providing great benefit through its execution. So a set of companies approaching a transaction at this point, I think will have to high grade what they do in their filing applications and think much more directly about the audience. So it's not a compliance task to provide the filing. You have to do it, but you can use it as a leverage point to make many other arguments and to point out the benefits. Now, if you're out of a transaction, you just want to talk about consolidations. The proof is sort of in pudding. Savings have been realized. Costs have gone down where the rate of growth has been ameliorated. Capital has been spent. Operations have improved. Customer rates have generally stayed kind of constant until recently because of escalation. But that's a supply kind of issue right now. But the intent of a transaction past has carried through in terms of its purpose. And there's no reason to believe that won't occur in the future because the fundamentals are still the same. But companies just need to consider the needs in terms of what information people need. And just like they're trying to talk about the benefits of decarbonization and electrification, or consolidation is just one of those piece parts.
And that story should be told not just to your own customers, but it should be told industry-wide, right?
Well, it should be told industry-wide, which means that the audiences are economy-wide. It's Capitol Hill. It's the individual state legislatures. It's specifically the commissions. It's the industrial customers who want to intervene in these cases. It's where the money comes from. It's not just the traditional investment banks. It's all the other venture capital funds, the infrastructure funds, the ESG community, which has become unto itself, in terms of its significance. To all the environmentalists, all of those have to get more coherently addressed, kind of across the industry, rather than just sort of with the local audiences.
Well, let's end then with you making, and I know towards the end of the book you do write about not having a crystal ball. So I'm not going to ask you to put on your crystal ball, but I will ask you to at least attempt to give us maybe a 10-year window and a 20-year window, because the last part of the book you talk about in the short term you see some potential continuation of this consolidation trend. But then you say, well, I don't have the crystal ball, so into the future, anything could happen. So if you were to sort of try and place a bet, if you may, how many years do you think we expect to see greater consolidation, and where do you see the sort of it plateauing? Where we say we have enough now, we have the right number of utilities in the U.S.
Let me take you back to a comment that Ed Torello at Deutsche Bank at the time made, I think in the mid-90s, where he said that he had an expectation of 50 companies in 5 years. Well, he was directionally correct, but a little bit accelerated because it took longer to get to 50 from that 150 to start with. So maybe the flip is true. Could we have 5 companies in 50 years? Which means there's substantial consolidation. And you kind of go back to almost looking like, kind of a modified RTO map, right? Where you have regional organizations. There's plenty of reasons why that may not happen, particularly the population out in the plain states and the West Coast prevent that. But there's no reasons to think that consolidation at 2, 3, or 4 a year won't continue. And there's no theoretical limit to how far you can go. But pretty soon you're going to run out of the natural things to do. So that'll happen closer to 20 than will to 10. But there'll be significant consolidation from the 40s kind of thing we have right now to deal with versus the smaller sector at that point in time. So don't have a hard answer for you, but there's no reason you can't get down to a dozen.
Yeah. Well, listen, Tom, thank you so much for joining us. I really enjoyed the conversation. Congratulations again on the book. And again, our guest has been Tom Flaherty, author of Roll Up. Thanks for joining us. This is Lawrence Jones, and see you at the next Influential Minds.